Right. This is going to be another part one, part two. So I've broken this up in a particular way, but this is on the power of God, and he starts, as he always does, with a verse. And it is from Job 26:14, which says in the ESV, "Behold, these are but the outskirts of his ways, and how small a whisper do we hear of him. But the thunder of his power, who can understand?" So you see the layers of that verse. Behold, or look, or see. So in other words, here's the part you can see. These, everything you're thinking of, from a small thing, a flower changing to an exploding supernova, those are just the outskirts. So even when he says, how small a whisper, he's including even the most powerful things you can think of are just the echo or the whisper of, and then the last part, the thunder of his power. Who can now? So this last part brings it back to the essence of God. This is referring to the effects of God. The most awesome example you can think of are just the tip of the iceberg. But in his essence, that power is utterly different than the effects of his power. So just contemplating that verse by itself prepares us to see all the distinctions that Charnock is going to make. And from this passage, he derives this doctrine. This is his sort of big idea for the whole chapter. He says that infinite and incomprehensible power pertains to the nature of God and is expressed in part in his works. See what he did there? He just did what I looked at in Job 26:14. The first part looking at the outer layers, the whisper, even the most powerful things you could think of. But Charnock starts where Job ends there. Infinite and incomprehensible power belongs to his essence. So this you do not see, you cannot comprehend, you cannot understand. Nothing in creation, in fact, all of it in creation combined, does not contain even a speck. That power pertains to the nature of God and is only expressed in part in his works. Or, though there may, this is another way to say it, though there be a mighty expression of divine power in his works, yet an incomprehensible power pertains to his nature. So in the second part of the statement, he's just flipping over, saying in a different way, so you can hear him for emphasis, the two layers here. God's power in himself, his essential power, what belongs to him, is incommunicable. We'll talk about that in a second. Whereas everything else, everything you see, everything you can think about, that's the whisper, Job is saying. So here's the breakdown. And as I said, when you start getting to 90 pages, you start saying part one, part two. So that's what we did. So next week we'll cover the manifestations and the uses of the doctrine. But here we're just looking at the nature of God's power, which is the bulk of what we're going to talk about. And then we'll briefly look at remember how he uses that word reasons, his arguments, meaning typically he's going to compare one or more attributes to the attribute that he's talking about. And he's saying, if this is true, this has to be true too. Or reverse, if this is true, it cannot be. So you need this in order for God to be God. And in this case, it's going to be four ways to see that omnipotence is necessary. Or else, how do you explain this? Basically is what he's doing with the reasons. Okay, but we'll get to that. But the bulk of what we're going to talk about is the nature of divine power. And you have to understand when you're reading the scripture, before he gets into some more doctrinal distinctions, he wants to make an exegetical distinction. In other words, this first distinction he wants you to get, so you don't get confused or waste time when you're reading the scriptures, collecting words or doing a word study, you say, well, it talks about power over here, and you have to make a distinction that word in the English can be interpreted from different Greek words and mean different things. And there's other Greek words that border on that, or that the English could possibly render as power, like kratein is to rule, or kratos is a ruler. And there's other words like energo, which typically will be translated as work. But Charnock doesn't cover those. He only covers two. One is exousia. And there are cases where that word can be translated as power, but it's really talking about the authority kind of power. So if there's now, like in Matthew 28:18, all exousia, there in most English translations it says authority. All authority has been given to Christ. So there it does the help for you. It does it. But there are verses where it'll be translated power, and you have to realize it's not talking about what you're thinking of. You're thinking of muscle. You're thinking of explosion. You're thinking of efficiency, causation. But it's actually talking about authority, like an office or a scope of where that power is exerted. That's a different thing. What we're talking about here, what Charnock's talking about, when we say omnipotence, from that that's coming from the Greek, that's going to come from the Latin, which we'll talk about in a second. But potency, we're talking about this. We're talking about the Greek word dunamis. So, for example, Acts 1:8, the promise of the Holy Spirit was, you will receive dunamis. English word we get from that? Dynamite. And dynamism and dynamic. So there it's talking about potency. Okay? He's just telling you up front, don't confuse these things. Don't waste too much time on trying to get through this when maybe only a fifth of those passages are the ones that you really want to hone in on here. Okay, so once we know which word we're talking about and the sense it's being used, he's going to make now a first doctrinal distinction. Now, when I say he's making these distinctions, he's kind of think of a sculptor here. If I'm giving you a definition and I'm chiseling things away, what am I doing? By process of elimination, I'm eliminating all the dross, if you're making a sword, or if you're making a sculpture, you're just getting all you're sanding off all the things that are going to start to make a picture emerge here. And that's why he's making these distinctions. This is not just really nerdy stuff. This is to help us understand, here's what I mean, here's what I don't mean. And so his first doctrinal distinction, once you get, okay, that's the kind of power we're talking about. But now you're going to get confused in all these sorts of God versus the world kind of stuff. The same basic reorientation that needs to happen when we look at God's knowledge or God's love or any of these other things. We start to define God from the creature on up to the Creator. We project on him imperfections. And what we're trying to do here, Charnock's trying to do, is chisel away those things of the creature so that by means of what he is not, what he can't possibly be, we get a clearer picture of what he is. So this was a Latin distinction, and you can recognize the words. First of all, the word potentia, potential, potency. And it's from that we derive this English word and a set of other English words, but we get power from that concept at least. So what are they modifying adjectives? Absoluta ordinata. Now, Charnock calls this, what does he call it? He doesn't say ordained, he says ordinate power. So it doesn't matter. So if Charnock says ordinate or some other theologian says ordained, just know he's talking about the same thing. What's the difference here? This is God's power in himself. This is God's power exerting itself. Now, we're going to have to make some other distinctions there so you don't get the wrong idea. Oh, here's the part of God that doesn't change, and here's the part of God that does change. No. We already covered that with immutability. But just back up from that for a second, and this distinction is going to be a very, very important one between our conception of God's power as God is in himself, and then, as Job talked about, the whispers, the way that we perceive it as it comes to us, the outskirts. So Charnock explains the difference, and I'll come back to that little chart, but he's going to help us. He says, absolute is that power whereby God is able to do that which he will not do, but is possible to be done. I'm going to bring some circles in just a second, which I think will help the rest of the way. But see what he's doing here? This is talking about that power whereby God is able to do something. It's what he has potential, and that's going to create a problem too. So God has potential, like he needs to be activated? No, not that. That's not what we're talking about. So this outer circle is going to be the bigger circle. This is going to be all that God is able to do. So get that in your mind. Now, ordinate is that power whereby God does that which he has decreed to do. That is, which he has ordained or appointed to be exercised. So, let's do some circles. And I'm going to bring in the circle from 2 weeks ago. Because I think when you compare these, God's knowledge and God's power, you're going to see some symmetry. And some things are going to start falling into place. And therefore, you'll be able to understand this a lot more quickly. Because those categories, because you'll look at them and say, I see the same relationship, except here it's not talking about his knowledge, it's talking about its power, or his power. So I'll explain where the words are in just a second, but just similar to what we saw in those categories about knowledge, natural and free, you have to see the actual as a subset of the possible. So when you heard Charnock just a second ago say, hey, there's these two kinds of power. One's absolute. This is what he will not do, but he can. Here's what he will do. Did you, in your mind, see those as two separate circles? So that what Charnock is saying is that here's what he can do but doesn't. Here's what he does do, but is that outside of that circle? Similar to knowledge, if it is actual, well, then it's possible. And this is where silly ideas like Molinism come from, is taking those circles and separating them or overlapping them wrongly. Here, if it's actual, I'm going to say the same thing. If it's actual, then it's possible. So Charnock is not saying these are two separate circles. He's saying this is a species of that. If God does it, well, then he was able to do it. If it is an ordained power, then it belongs to his absolute power. So I think maybe Charnock could have added a half a clause to this sentence to qualify that, because it can come across that he's saying that what the defining characteristic of the absolute power is what he will not do. No, that would be a distraction if you read it that way. He's just saying this. In other words, here's a way maybe you could have said it in updated English. All that God is able to do, including or even if he did not do it. Okay? The idea there is his ability. I don't want to say the word potential because that'll lead to another mistake, but it is technically from the Latin word potentia, which means power. So that's that very, very, very important thing to see, because then when you read this back onto that, you'll hopefully maybe see another problem, or at least it'll intensify what's wrong with Molinism or open theism or any of those ideas that, God cannot see, he can see all that is possible and necessary, but some things that are actual, he can. You're separating that circle from the bigger circle. Okay? So I just wanted to linger there a little longer so you could see that connection. Let's erase that second circle and keep this circle to see the next distinction that Charnock is going to make, and you might have remembered it from 3 slides ago. There's this weird way of saying this, repugnant to God's own nature. Now, most theologians, at least today, would say something that is contradictory to God's nature or self-contradictory. So when he says repugnant to something's own essence, this is a distinction, but he's actually going to bring these into the same category. Because then there's the objection, can God do such and such? Oh, he can't? Well, then he's not all-powerful. He lacks that ability. And good theologians will say, no, that's not actually a power. That's a meaningless combination of words. That's like a square circle and then tacking on the word God can, or God can draw a square circle. Okay, that you have something that is intrinsically contradictory. Charnock is just using the word repugnant to mean contradictory to. Okay, so that's just a little grammar for you so you understand how he's using that word. So back to that chart, leave that circle up there. Remember that ordained is within absolute, so I'm not actually making these mirror each other completely, but this stuff maybe is down in creation, so that's the only reason maybe it's down there. But they're both going to have the same problem. no matter what you try to ascribe to God and say, or challenge God to do if you're a skeptic. So this second distinction follows from the first in terms of what's possible. And this has to do with the typical definition of omnipotence. If you ask the average person, what does omnipotence mean? It means, that means power to do all things. So if you really mean that, then he ought to be able to draw square circles. He ought to be able to do that. Or the classic, the new classic, can God make a rock too heavy for himself to lift? Ha ha! Aren't I clever? No, not really. Now that'll take a little bit longer to show the contradiction, maybe 30 seconds, 5 minutes maybe, depending on how well we do at being concise at explaining it. But it's going to suffer the same problem. And none of these things are going to be able to actually apply to this for some reason, so I have to explain that a little bit. So when it says that God's omnipotence means his power to do all things, the main qualifier there is things. Square circles are non-things. Not because no one's ever made the right combination on the graph paper, but because the thing is impossible in itself. It is repugnant to its own nature. Or what about a married bachelor? Has the census worker ever found the married bachelor? Maybe he just needs to knock on one more door. No, a married person is a non-bachelor, and a bachelor is a non-married person by definition. Okay, so just remember our logic here. So those are non-entities. Those are nonsensical expressions. They can't be made in any possible world to be things. So when I hear the definition of God's omnipotence as the power to do all things, I must define things as things and not non-things. So that's basically the problem here. Think of that infamous objection. God should be able, or an omnipotent being should be able to make a rock too heavy for himself to lift. If he can't do it, then he lacks an ability. But remember, an ability is an ability to do something, not nothing. And so a meaningless combination of words that represents a nothing, it's nonsense to speak of an ability to do that. That would actually be, to even be confused about that would actually be a diminishing of power. If I'm even confused as to, is that even a thing? Even that hesitation and lack of energy is a lack of power. But of course, that falling into nothing is a subtraction of power, not an addition of power. Now, I realize that might seem, that's really nitpicky and goofy and stuff like that. And why are you calling me during Sunday school? You know I'm a pastor. I always love that when I get it. I know better now. I always leave my phone is off, but I didn't used to remember to do that. I'd get calls when I'm up at the pulpit and stuff. I'm like, come on, it's Sunday. Anyway, so yeah, omnipotence. You have to define your terms correctly. If your inability to define your terms correctly is not an impressive challenge. So that's here's how Charnock says it in longhand. He says the object of his absolute power is all things possible. Such things that imply not a contradiction. I'm going to be annoying, but I have to linger on this one more second to say one more thing about it. We use the words possible and impossible just kind of like we do with awesome or perfect, or we're not very precise in our language. In fact, words themselves have been devalued to such an extent that we don't use even basic words in their proper context with their proper sense. And so we do the same thing with possible and impossible. And Christians do this. I think we watch too many Disney movies. God can do the impossible. That's a meaningless combination of words. To say so is not to cast any doubt on God. God has all power, but his subject are things, even things that don't exist. That's not impossible, because at one point, nothing besides God existed. So there's no contradiction in God creating something that does not exist. It is a contradiction for him to, and I'm going to let Charnock talk from here, because he's going to give you examples. The object of his absolute power is all things, that's key, possible, that's key. There's two keys. You have to know what those words mean. Most people floating around today don't know what the word thing means, and they don't know what the word possible. You say, that's absurd. You're charging the entire human race, or at least the majority of them, with not knowing the meaning of the word things? Yes. Without hesitation, I hear people. They don't know what it means. Possible, people don't even know it's possible. That's impossible that people don't know what it means. You just misused it right there. So yes, I'm absolutely saying that people don't know what those words mean. And you have to think about them and get your definition correct in order to understand the larger definition here. So he says, such things that imply not a contradiction. That is what possible means. You can't make it mean something just because you like to think about it or because you feel magic-y or feelsy or you watch too many Disney movies. None of that is your source for understanding what possible and impossible means. Possible means something without contradiction. But that's mean. I don't like studying logic. Too bad. That's what the word means in any possible world. Such things that imply not a contradiction, such that are not repugnant. Here, he's going to unpack. That's what he's doing here. He's explaining what he means by not a contradiction. In other words, such that are not repugnant in their own nature to be done, and such as are not contrary to the nature and perfections of God to be done. So he gives you, before I give the example, he gives you the two layers of what he means by repugnant or contradictory. What do I mean by impossible? I mean two things. Anything that is contradictory to itself, square circles, or anything that is a contradiction to the nature of God, which comes to mean the same thing when you think it through. An omnipotent being lacking a power, which has to do with things. So you have to think hard about something that at the first glance might seem pretty simple. He clarifies with examples. Yeah. Those things that are repugnant in their own nature to be done are several. In other words, Charnock, can you help me out here? Can you put some flesh on this? What do you mean? Give me some examples. Several. As to make a thing that is past not to be past. As, for example, the world is created. Stop. I want to make an objection to Charnock right here. Wait, are you saying? No, you can't be saying that. God could have not created the world. Charnock would have said, I know, that's not what I said. Read it again. As to make a thing that is past not to be past. Objection 2, Charnock. You just said God is outside of time a couple weeks ago. Are you saying that God cannot, from outside of time, because he's not there at T-1 or whatever, he can from here or from above all of it not have created? Yep, I agree with that too. It's not what I said. Read it again. In other words, like a square circle, what we're denying here is that God can make a thing that is past. In other words, he has now done so to not be past, which is just an example of, or a species of, doing something and not doing that thing at the same time or at the same relationship. You say, well, God's not in time, so he can't be in time anyway, or in the same relationship. It is a contradiction in terms that God has done it and not done it. That's specifically what Charnock's saying. Okay? And why do I draw that out? Because you can make those two objections. You can maybe misread him or not have thought through it that rigidly. And as an example of a thing repugnant to God's own nature, he says, as it is impossible for his nature to die and perish, so it is impossible for him in regard of truth to lie and deceive. People could say, oh, what about the lying spirits in the book of Kings? God got those. Yes, God got them to lie for him. But that isn't he. He is causing deceivers to deceive for his own purposes, but he himself does not lie. Okay, and we could multiply examples of that from the scriptures or elsewhere. Or, elsewhere, he gives another example. For to be unable to do evil is the perfection of power, and to be able to do things unjust and evil is a weakness, imperfection, and inability. You say, wait a minute, Satan's exerting energy in doing evil. When I lie or steal, there's enzymes going and whatever, and I think we're misunderstanding something. A flickering light bulb is plugged in. So the mistake you're making is to say, when I see evil show up in the world, some wheels are turning. Yes, some wheels are borrowing from energy that was already there, but it actually is dwindling. When you participate in evil, you're actually not increasing in your being, you are diminishing in your being. The Bible uses the word corrupt or corruptible for that very reason. It's borrowing from this word that we typically use in physics and physical things breaking down, and it applies it to spiritual things, that your soul can actually corrupt, disintegrate, be disordered. And so what Charnock is saying there absolutely holds. To do evil is not to increase in power or to exert an original power. It can borrow from power, but it does so as a shadow does from light, or as rust is to metal, or any other number of metaphors that you could use. In other words, in both categories, the problem here with the genius, as he sees himself to be, the skeptic, God should be able to make a rock too heavy for himself to lift, or he should be able to lie, or he should be able to die, or he should be able to create another God, or so on and so forth. The problem in both of these categories, something being repugnant in its own nature, or something being repugnant to God's nature, the problem is not any lack of power in God. This is no exception to the rule of absolute power. What we're showing here is a contradiction in terms that the skeptic, or just somebody who's wondering this, the mistake you're making is that you are raising a contradiction in terms as if it were a power, as if it could be a thing, and saying God should be able to do that. C.S. Lewis talked about this famously in his book, The Problem of Pain. He uses the expression intrinsically impossible. And he says this, he says, "It is no more possible for God than for the weakest of his creatures to carry out both of two mutually exclusive alternatives. Not because his power meets an obstacle, but because nonsense remains nonsense even when we talk it about God." So the ability to draw a square circle is not an ability that I possess or God possesses, because it's not an ability at all, because it's not a thing. Okay? So you can't talk about that non-thing being done really, really, really well. Or if we just jumpstart that non-thing. No, you couldn't put the plugs on there because it's a non-thing. Well, likewise about working against his own decrees. If God decrees something, it's not a lack of power that he undoes it, or that he goes back on it, or that he makes it not so. Okay? And so Charnock says, though God has absolute power to make worlds and infinite numbers of other creatures, and to render every creature a higher mark of his power, yet in regard of his decree to the contrary, he cannot do it. In other words, I'll give you a verse, 2 Timothy 2:13. If we are faithless, he remains faithful. Why? Because he cannot deny himself. It would not be a power for him to deny himself. So Charnock says, the exercise of his power is subordinate to his decree, but not the essence of his power. The decree of God takes not away any power from God, because the power of God is his own essence and incapable of change, and is as great physically and essentially after his decree as it was before. When Jesus says that, when he said, "Who touched me?" in the crowd, and it was the woman that had the issue of blood, and they're like, the disciples, they're like, "What are you asking? There's like a whole crowd here. We don't know. What do you mean, who touched you?" And what was Jesus' response? That power went out of him. Well, that's his human nature. So no matter how much you want to slice that out, that was a divine power working through him, that was the Holy Spirit working through him. No matter how you explain that, and that's another, Charnock actually does address that later. Don't picture God as some kind of like a power plant or like a battery, and you got to recharge him or something, and where when he does exercise his absolute power into his ordained power, that power has gone out of him. Like, you've got 16 ounces of water and boom, 2 ounces go out, you got 14 left. No, that's not what's going on. And so if we say, as Charnock is, and this is a complex thing to mix those two ideas together, that absolute and ordained power distinction versus can God contradict his own decree? So you're mixing these two very difficult concepts. He's putting them together here. He's saying to the person who says, well, he ought to be able to go against his decree, or he lacks a power. Charnock is, in a sense, saying, as if when God decrees a thing, he's giving up, like a move on a chessboard. He's choosing this, not that. Therefore, he doesn't have that anymore open to him. No, it's not like that. He retains his infinite, absolute power. Now, he does give other examples, which I don't get into all of them, but maybe I will give one or two. Other intrinsic impossibilities. He gives examples, which I'll just put that. Well, that's the picture now. We'll get to it. But other impossibilities that are not a lack of his power, for anything to be and not to be at the same time. That's just the law of non-contradiction. Example 2, for the sun to shine and not to shine at the same moment of time. That's just an application of the principle. Or for a creature to act and not to act at the same instant. Or for a creature to be made infinite, independent, and preserve itself. That would be a contradiction to God's own nature, to create another creator, essentially, a creature who's not really a creature. That's a contradiction, too, when I say it like that. Another thing we have to get right about ultimate power is that ultimate power is immaterial. I was going to draw a bunch of things down here, and I just ran out of time. But you can see the breakdown. In his essence, and then down here is an effect. So bring back Job 26:14. Down here is the whisper. You can think of the most powerful thing in the universe, the exploding supernovae, whatever. Or you can sum total it up. All the power you can possibly think of. What Job was saying is that all of that is the faint whisper. It's the part you see, the part you can sense, theoretically, with a telescope in those examples. So I don't have anything down there, but that's what that is meant to depict down there. Whereas here, power in God, and Job is saying that in the other part of the verse, is infinite, is absolute. One of the implications of that is that power in its essence, if you try to picture what power is, you picture the exploding supernovae. You picture some really strong person. You picture like a herd of elephants coming through. You picture a mountain. You picture a wrecking ball. Whatever. All of that is not the essence of power. The essence of power must be immaterial. And right away, we're at a loss. Because we're kind of depending on explosions and really hard objects swung fast or whatever it is to meet the criteria of what we have in mind by power. But if we think about it for a second, we'll see about even those examples that we're thinking of, that there's some immaterial thing that's moving them. And it must be the case. Or there would have been no catalyst. There would have been no activating whatever in each of their cases. Ultimate power is immaterial. Charnock says, what in human artificers is knowledge, labor, industry, that in God is his will. His will works without labor. His works stand forth as he wills them. Think of the different passages in Scripture that speak about God creating by his word, and it just popping up. The Scripture says in Revelation 4:11, for you created all things, and by your will they existed and were created. James 1:18, of his own will he brought us forth. So old creation and new creation. Generating of things biological or the heat in stars or whatever else, and regeneration of that spiritual principle in a spiritually dead person. And then everything, when he says, I make all things new, all of that is by God's will. All of that is immaterial. You can see this in reflecting upon some of these same distinctions. Charnock says, power in the primary notion of it. In other words, in the most essential aspect of power, the thing you should think about when you think of the very essence of power, does not signify an act but an ability to bring a thing into act. It is power as able to act before it does actually produce a thing. As God had an ability to create before he created. He had power before he acted that power without. Power notes the principle of the action and therefore is greater than the act itself. So on the right, I have, ignore the thing at the beginning. I'm doing that for the real nerds like me, because this actually creates another objection in our minds. But the potential to act, and I don't like using, I'll give you the nerdy stuff, because it's actually important here. Because remember, that came from the Latin potentia. So potential to act, in a sense, is greater than the act. My ability to act, my reason, in a sense, is greater than me solving the math problem, which is greater than me actually ink expressing that on the paper. It's what caused it. It's what exerted the energy. It's what explained it. It wouldn't be there, it would just be ink or the pen sitting there if there were not that potential. So we get that. Here's the problem it creates. The older thinkers, when they would talk about act and potency, and this originally comes from Aristotle, and all the Reformed people would talk like this, they understood that act has to be greater than mere potential in a different sense. Because when I think of something that is potential, a scrap of lumber is potentially this lectern. It's not just going to jump up and be that. There has to be someone come along with a saw and all these different things. It's just potentially that. Okay, so that comes first, but it's not superior. Some prior thing in act had to move the wood. Now God, since he's the first cause, can't be what the older thinkers would have called pure potentiality. He can't be potential in the same way that the wood is just sitting there. He has to be in what they call pure act. All true. And Charnock's already talked about that in the simplicity of God and spirituality. But he's talking now specifically about power. So he is abstracting this idea and saying, let's for now just talk about this and agree that the power to act is greater than the actualization or the effects out in this world, greater than the whisper. The whisperer is greater than the whisper. Okay? That's all he's saying right now. And so it needs, for something to be affecting in the actual world, something actually has to be a superior moving principle. Okay? So I'll skip my notes there because that's what I was getting at here. He says a couple other things I don't have a slide for. I only have so many slides. He says, power exercised and diffused in bringing forth and nursing up its particular objects without is inconceivably less than that strength which is infinite in himself, the same with his essence and is indeed himself. Now, in case I don't have it in my notes, let me just explain. We actually understand this already about ourselves. I use the example of me doing the math problem on the paper, that even about human beings who have bodies, our power is actually superior as in its immaterial essence. And that's true of anything else as well, even about the production of our body with DNA. So everything ultimately has an immaterial power that is animating everything towards certain ends that are physical, that we tend to think of as the power, but we're looking at the surface of it. We're not actually seeing the source of that power, the principle that animates everything. Okay, so that's what he wants, that's all he's talking about right now. Let me skip that. He says one more thing about this. This power, I'll come back to it. This power, so everything in this picture is in God. This is the last part of the picture I didn't explain yet. Inside the solid circle is just representing God's essence. That he raises the question that for some people, so are you saying, Charnock, that power is just the same thing as will, or maybe just the same thing as his knowledge and wisdom, but now it's being exerted? Because even the Bible's using language like by his word. So he just thinks a thought and that brings it about, but you said he thinks thoughts about possible worlds that he doesn't bring into being. So, and that's a good thought. That's one clue that they're not exactly the same thing. But of course, because of the simplicity of God, we see that in in God's being, all that is in God is God. He's not divided into parts. So you see, I have these other circles that are dotted, and this is what they would have called a logical distinction rather than a real distinction. Now that, I almost wish they had different words for that in our day, because we don't put as much into those words either. But all it means is that a real distinction is a distinction between two separable entities. I'm distinguishing between that thing and that thing. They are distinct entities. We just saw that's not true about God. He's not many different things. A logical distinction is when we abstract an idea from a thing, and so we're comparing two different concepts. We're not saying that that's not a real, see, that's the problem, is that we use the word real to mean something without distinction. So that's a little tougher, but the whole reason we can speak about God's attributes, it's what we've been doing the whole time, is we're making logical distinctions. Okay? So Charnock says, this power is of a distinct conception from the wisdom and will of God. They are not really distinct. So he uses that language that the scholastics would have between real and logical distinction. They are not really distinct, but according to our conceptions. That's a tough way for us to think. We think real, meaning it's real. That's true. But the way they're using that word is separable entities. That's a real distinction between. Think of a wall, space between two separate things. They're not really distinct, in other words, divided, but according to our conceptions. In our conceptions, Charnock says, the apprehension of a thing belongs to the understanding of God. That's what I mean by his mind. That's the understanding. Determination to the will of God. Direction to the wisdom of God. Execution to the power of God. So, good that you don't want to think of these four as solid lines, four separable entities. That's good. That's the simplicity of God. But we are able to speak of these as four real aspects or powers of God, attributes, in these four ways, right? When I speak of the knowledge of God, I'm speaking of apprehension. I'm just going to reverse engineer what Charnock said. When I speak of the determination of God, that's what I mean by his will. When I speak of the direction of things or ideas, the ordering of it, right ordering, that's the wisdom of God. And when I speak of the execution of that rightly ordered preference he has according to what he knows, that execution of it is my reference to the power of God. Okay? I know that's a lot. But now I'm just bringing back these from the first picture into this picture. And this is all just the definition. And it gives you another idea of why it had to be 2 weeks. Consider again the distinction between God's absolute power, his ability to do, versus his ordained power, what he wills to do. Charnock says, but his absolute power is larger than his resolving will. And that's just a new way that Charnock is saying ordinate power, since God ordains what he resolves to do. Absolute is bigger, it's the bigger circle. For though Scripture tells us he has done whatsoever he wills, yet it tells us not that he has done whatsoever he could. He can do things that he never will do. So another implication of omnipotence is divine invincibility. So now we're just going to take this idea and we're going to position, and so now I'm glad I have a blank space there. Because now I want to say, as the scripture says, that he accounts these things, even the nations, as nothing. Doesn't mean they don't exist. It means, by comparison, if we're going to do a comparison of the gods, as he does in those chapters in Isaiah, think of these right now as nothing. Because in terms of resistance, in terms of any ability to stop God from doing what he wants to do, zippo. They've got no power by comparison. All other power is relativized to the point of comparative, total non-power. If there's ever any conflict between God's power and some other power, whether it's a natural power, whether it's a personal power, The very power that upholds that rival power is God's power. The very power that, in a sense, empowers, but by corruption in the devil is borrowing from God's power. He can't create anything new. He has no ability to do anything that God does not appoint or direct him to do for his own ends. In other words, God must be the least frustrated being conceivable. So when we speak on a popular level, well, God wants to do this. God wants to help you, but God would have been there, but God is trying to, and we'll even slip into that speech sometimes, God is trying to get you to see when we're frustrated about something. But actually, technically speaking, God is never wringing his hands. God is never, as we say, pacing the floors of heaven. He is never breaking a sweat. Give you a couple scriptures. Psalm 115:3, our God is in the heavens. He does all that he pleases. Or as Job confessed in Job 42:2, that no purpose of yours can be thwarted. Or elsewhere in Daniel 4:35, none can stay your hand, or his hand in this case. Charnock speaks of the strength of other things, that these relate to God's absolute power by a possibility of nature. They can be. Yet he says, not by any strength in themselves or of themselves, for nothing has no strength. A nothing doesn't have any power. And everything is nothing before it comes into being, end quote. This is a crucial distinction when we're talking about the impossible and when we're talking about miracles. This is the subject that he starts to talk about. Miracles, okay? When God alters the present conditions of the actual world, he's not doing something intrinsically impossible. He's doing something that's relatively impossible. In other words, given dead people don't rise. Is that true? About natural things, that's a better way to say that technically would be dead people don't ordinarily rise. How ordinarily? Well, every time, unless, and that's the problem, is that the course of nature or just inductive reasoning or just counting on a number line of all the people who have died, I would have to have infinite knowledge to be able to say that no dead person has ever risen, or, in other words, no miracle has ever taken place. That was kind of the argument of David Hume against miracles. But that is to confuse concepts. So when John the Baptist said, and this is an example Charnock uses in Matthew 3:9, God is able from these stones to raise up children for Abraham. No contradiction is involved here. Now here you have two strikes. Number one, you can't normally make stones anything less than stones. Number two, they certainly don't turn into human beings. I guess there's three problems. Number three, they don't become regenerated on top of it. Okay? So normally, according to the natural pattern of things, stones don't rise into regenerate children of Abraham. And yet, there's no contradiction. Why is that? Because he's not saying, didn't Charnock just say something which is repugnant to its nature? Correct. God in a miracle, if John the Baptist's words were to be fulfilled, if that was something in God's decree, to actually take actual literal stones and turn them into a son of Abraham, would that involve a contradiction? No. Because in that case, just like Jesus walking on water, he is creating something that is new in the ordinary course of things. He's not making water not be water. He's not making rocks not be rocks. The child of Abraham in that case would no longer be a rock. Okay? So that in and of itself is not a contradiction. This is important when we understand our definition of miracles. The claim is that God is going to create, just as surely as he created at the beginning, ex nihilo. That's what's happening when a miracle comes in. Okay? I know he defines it at one point. I'm going to skip a bunch of stuff just for time's sake. He does make one more distinction, and that's between the incommunicable and the communicable. Because when we're talking about essential power, so again, you think, okay, volume 2, we've crossed over into the communicable attributes, because these are the attributes that human beings have. Human beings have, in some measure, knowledge, wisdom, and power. Right? But his essential power in himself, as he has it, is incommunicable. Okay, so when you talk about omnipotence, that's very different. Here's a verse that gives us a clue. Psalm 62:11. Once God has spoken, twice I have heard this, that power belongs to God. So the essence of power is something that belongs to him in a unique way. Now, as I said, there's the very brief section, and it's kind of okay that we don't get into it time-wise before we talk about the manifestations and use. But I can pull this into next week as well. Is it these reasons for God's power? He just gives you 4 arguments that omnipotence must be the case. First, from the existence of power in the world. He says, there is no creature but can act something. In some way, in other words. Okay, this is very curious, even in the smallest things. He says, how powerful is a small seed to rise into a mighty tree? How wonderful is the power of the Creator who has endowed so small a creature as a seed with so fruitful an activity. So in this argument, he's borrowing from a principle called the principle of proportionate causality. It's not just sufficient cause, it's proportionate causality. He's saying, in effect, well, we know this exists in the world, power, efficiency. And the question is, what explanation is sufficient to account for there being power at all? So this becomes his first argument, and he brings some scriptures in. Psalm 94:10, for example. He who teaches man knowledge, shall he not know? I skipped a part there, but that was about a particular efficiency or action. He cites this, and he says, well, that has to be true of power, that God teaches all these different, he animates, is what I'm trying to say, and that's actually the idea behind that imagery there, is the wheel is representing the creaturely efficiency, but it has to be moved by power in general. And he says, all the power that is distinct in the creatures must be united in God. Every creature is but a cistern filled with a particular and limited power according to the capacity of its nature. From this fountain, all are distinct streams from God. This is also true. He mentions false signs or false wonders and lying signs. And there's a bunch of scriptures that talk about this. I mentioned the devil before. Even false prophets and even miracle workers that are lying signs. And there's a bunch of scriptures that talk about that in Old and the New. They are borrowing from God. Think of the Egyptians the magicians of Pharaoh and people like that would be examples. Just to give you a lay of the land, the second and the third argument, and I won't go into this too much, are from divine perfection and divine simplicity. These are super short sections. This is like one page. He covers both of these, but he argues in a sense that if God were not omnipotent, then he couldn't be perfect. If God were not omnipotent, he couldn't be simple. Or in this case, reverse it. If he wasn't simple and spiritual, in other words, if he's composed of parts, that would be a lack of power. And he shows that even in examples in this world. And then lastly, he ends up at miracles itself. And I already introduced that idea, but I'll just read his quote here. He gives a definition of miracles too, actually. And he kind of anticipates the modern objection of Hume and others when he says, whoever denies miracles must deny all possibility of miracles, and so must imagine himself fully skilled in the extent of divine power. So in other words, he has to show that nature is cut off from supernatural power, or that he's examined all cases and so forth. But he says about all created things down there, he says, no element is so obstinate and deaf, but it hears and obeys his voice and performs his orders, though contrary to its own nature. Stop. Is he contradicting himself? Didn't he say anything that was repugnant to its own nature? But remember, there he meant a contradiction. A creation of things and then God not having created those things. So the idea there is a square circle. He does not mean like the rock, that God cannot create a human being where the rock stood. That the human is not a rock and the rock is not a human. Okay? So no, he's not contradicting himself. He says, all the violence of the creature is suspended as soon as it receives his command. He who gave the original to nature can take away the necessity of nature. He presides over creatures, but is not confined to the laws he has prescribed to creatures. He framed nature and can turn the channels of nature according to his own pleasure. Okay, I'll stop there, and again, part 2 next week, we'll look at the manifestations of God's power. Same breakdown as last time in creation, redemption, or I guess government or preservation, and then redemption, those three things, and then the uses, practical uses of the doctrine. So let me